My name is Kathleen Reeves. I'm 66 years old, retired, and a widow. I used to be a full-time wife, mother, and invisible backbone of the family. Now, I mostly talk to my hydrangeas and cook chicken soup for people who say they'll visit and rarely do. That Thursday, I was in my kitchen, simmering David's favorite, my homemade chicken soup with thyme and roasted garlic, because he and Camilla were coming the next day. I just turned off the stove when my phone buzzed. A voice message. From David. I smiled before even hitting play. That smile died fast. I can't stand this useless old hag. Once she's gone, her 8 million will be ours. Paris, here we come. I don't remember putting the phone down. I just remember staring at the pot of soup, still steaming, and thinking, that voice, that tone, I hadn't heard it before. Or maybe I had, in smaller, quieter ways. This time, there was no sugarcoating, just venom and calculation. I should have dropped to the floor, should have wept, should have called and screamed. Instead, I walked to the living room, sat down in Robert's old armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and I called one person. Put our plan into action, I said, and then I hung up. Not out of spite, not out of rage, but because something inside me finally snapped loose from the illusion I'd been clinging to. You see, Robert, my husband of 41 years, knew something long before I did. In the last 6 months of his life, he warned me. Katie, he said, thin and pale in his hospice bed, people get strange around death and money. Even your own blood, I had rolled my eyes then. Not David. He's not built like that, Robert didn't argue. He just squeezed my hand and made me promise. So I did. And Robert, being Robert, made sure there were protections, legal mechanisms, fail-safes. He called it the contingency plan, though I thought it was just a paranoid exercise for a dying man who wanted to feel in control. Turns out he wasn't paranoid. He was prescient. And that voice message, the one my son accidentally sent me instead of his wife, was the trigger. I can't stand this useless old hag. Once she's gone, her 8 million will be ours. Paris, here we come. I could hear Camilla laughing softly in the background, like it was a joke, like I was already gone. But I was still here, breathing, listening, holding the phone like a snake that had just hissed in my ear. I sat in that chair for a long time, long enough for the soup to go cold, long enough to feel every memory I'd ever wrapped around David begin to unravel. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions in a Dixie cup, the teenager who cried in my arms after his first heartbreak, the man I thought would carry on his father's quiet decency. But now, all I could see was a man who looked at his mother and saw a price tag, a number, an obstacle to a Paris vacation. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was hollow. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of a spoon being dropped into a sink and echoing through a kitchen built by decades of sacrifice. I looked around the room, at the curtains I sewed myself, the photo frames I dusted every Sunday, the worn wood floors I'd cleaned on my knees. This was the life I had given everything to build. And in that moment, I understood something I should have known years ago. Love doesn't excuse betrayal, and blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. I reached into the cabinet above the fridge, pulled out a dusty folder labeled Robert Private. Inside was everything Glenn would need: the will, the trust updates, the emergency clause. All ready, all signed, all legal. I dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. Kathleen? It's time, Glenn, I said. He sent the message. A pause. Then, you want to activate the clause? Yes. And Glenn, don't hesitate. I want everything in motion before they show up for soup tomorrow. Understood. I ended the call and put the phone down gently. Outside, the sky had begun to turn peach orange, the way it always did before Robert used to come home from work and tell me, "You're glowing, Katie." Just like that sky, he was gone. But his wisdom wasn't. And this time, I would protect myself like he asked me to. Because if David thought I was just a frail old woman with a house full of antiques and a bank account he could spend, then he never really knew me at all. And tomorrow, he would. He absolutely would. 3 years earlier, before tomorrow's soup or any talk of Paris, I learned how a promise can weigh more than a wedding ring. Robert's hospital room hummed. Winter light fell through the blinds in narrow ladders. He looked smaller than the man who once lifted mulch bags with one arm, yet his eyes were clear. "Sit," he said, patting the bed. I did. He traced the veins on my wrist like he was memorizing a map home. "Katie, when it comes to money, even the best hearts get twisted. Not always, but often enough that love needs guardrails." I wanted to argue, to say our son had a gentle core. The words rose, then broke like a wave that met rock. Robert coughed, waited for pain to settle, and nodded toward the tote under the chair. Inside lay a dark blue folder. Tabs in his neat block letters. Will, trust, medical, contingencies, counsel. "Protection plan," Robert said. "You sign nothing new without Glenn. You let nothing change if anyone starts rushing you. If you sense pressure, you call him, and the system wakes up." I flipped pages. Clauses I had never imagined. An independent capacity evaluation if a relative questioned my judgment. A trust that shifted beneficiaries if coercion was documented. A letter of wishes explaining why we chose boundaries over blind faith. There was even a small fund marked investigation, set aside for verification if rumors or sudden paperwork appeared. "This is too much," I whispered. "It feels like admitting we failed as parents." Robert squeezed my hand. "It is admitting we are human. Good people make bad choices when fear or debt sits on their chest. I am not writing our son off. I am writing you safe." He asked for my scarf from the chair, the old wool one he wore to prune roses. I wrapped it around his shoulders. Lavender from home softened the sterile air. He breathed easier. "We built a life by small, honest things," he said. "Meals at the table. Paid bills. The mortgage we tamed like a stubborn horse. Promise me you will protect small, honest things when big numbers start shouting." I nodded, but not fully. Back then, I believed love alone could anchor a family. I signed because he asked, not because I saw the storm he saw. Glenn visited the next afternoon, removing his coat with quiet efficiency. He reviewed every sheet with us in the language of neighbors. He explained triggers, paper trails, and how silence can be a shield if used with wisdom. "If anyone, including family, attempts undue influence," he said, "the trust pivots to charitable beneficiaries. If anyone suggests you are unfit, we commission a neutral assessment. If someone opens credit in your name, the bank alerts this office. If you feel cornered, you call me. I call the play." Robert smiled. Football metaphors for a dentist and a teacher. "Whatever works," Glenn said. We signed with steady strokes. Robert looked at me after each pen lift, searching my face for fear. I gave him a smile I hoped would make him forget the tubes in his arm. He did not forget. He believed anyway. When Glenn left, dusk blurred the window, and monitors ticked like patient metronomes. Robert reached for my hand again. "One more thing. If I go first, do not sell the house because you feel lonely. Loneliness is a poor accountant. Keep what holds you until you choose differently." "You think I'll be alone long," I said, trying for lightness. "I think you will be brave," he said. Brave people are sometimes lonely, then free. He slept, and I watched his chest lift under the scarf. I remembered the night our boy cut his knee on the driveway. Robert washed the gravel and said, "Look at me, son." Pain is a messenger, not the truth, David calmed. We went inside for cocoa. Memory is a room with many doors. That night, I shut the one marked fear and opened the one marked promise. I placed the blue folder in our home safe when I returned. I dusted it. I told myself I would probably never need it. I also tucked the scarf into the cedar chest, folded like a blessing. 3 years can pass in a handful of chore lists. You learn which clerk will carry heavy bags without pity. You make chicken soup on Thursdays because habit is a scaffold. You tell yourself your son is busy, not distant. You do not imagine a sentence that can break a marriage to memory, a voice message with $8 million dangling like a bell in a thief's hand. I did not imagine it then. I do now. And because I promised Robert, I was ready. The plan waited, quiet and steady. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. Not screaming, not bold, just soft enough to dismiss if you wanted to believe the best. And for too long, I wanted exactly that. 6 months ago, David started calling more frequently. That should have been a good thing, but the tone had changed. Instead of, "Hi, Mom. How's your garden?" It was, "Hey, you still managing all that space by yourself?" Or, "You must get lonely in that big house." At first, I laughed it off. "I'm not lonely," I told him once. "I'm just quiet." "There's a difference." He chuckled. "Right. But maybe quiet's too close to empty these days." Camilla wasn't as subtle. She showed up one Sunday with iced coffee and a brochure. "Golden Haven," it said. "Luxury senior living with chef-prepared meals, massage therapy, art classes." "It's not a nursing home," she rushed to clarify. "It's like a resort, totally independent. And it's safer, too. Less maintenance. Plus, you'd make friends." I remember holding the glossy paper between my fingers, noticing how she'd highlighted the word equity options. I smiled and said I'd think about it. Then I slid the brochure under a stack of old gardening magazines and never touched it again. But they didn't let up. Every time David came by, I could feel him sizing up the place. He'd linger in the hallway, tapping on the hardwood floor like a realtor. He once asked how old the water heater was. Another time, he mentioned how popular our street had become on Zillow. "You could get a great price, Mom," he said. "This place is worth more than you think." He always tacked on a softener. "I just don't want you to feel burdened, is all." It's a lot for one person. What he meant was, it's a lot of asset for one person. I wanted to believe he was concerned, that he noticed the creaks in the stairs, the way I slowed down going up and down. But that kind of concern always seemed to circle back to a market appraisal. And then there was the night of the horse cough. We were having dinner here, chicken and rosemary potatoes, and I started coughing. Not dramatically, just a dry tickle. David looked up from his plate and said, "Maybe it's time to think about downsizing." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Want some water?" Just straight to downsizing. It landed with more weight than he probably intended. Or maybe he intended exactly that. I said nothing in the moment. Just nodded, took a sip of water, and let Camilla change the subject to their upcoming trip to the coast. But I felt it. That subtle shift where my well-being wasn't the concern. My capacity was. He didn't ask if I needed help with anything. He asked if I'd considered selling. The more I replay those interactions, the more I see the strategy. Like breadcrumbs in reverse, each one meant to lead me out of my own home. What's worse is that I almost accepted it. That's the truth I don't like to say out loud, because part of me, the tired part, wanted to believe they had my best interest at heart. That maybe I was overthinking. That maybe it really was too much house, too many memories, too many staircases. But I kept hearing Robert's voice in my head. They'll speak like they're worried for you. But listen carefully. Are they asking about your comfort or your assets? I listened. They never asked about my joy, or what kept me going, or whether I still loved this old house with the creaky floors and the sunroom where I drink tea with my feet wrapped in wool socks. They asked about plumbing, taxes, efficiency. That's not family. That's a strategy meeting. Even the way Camilla praised the Golden Haven retirement community felt rehearsed. They have a shuttle service for errands, and the food's organic. I wanted to ask her if she thought I'd forgotten how to drive, or cook, or live, but I didn't. Because the truth is, I was afraid to say it out loud, that my son and his wife weren't just trying to help, they were trying to hasten a future where I was out of the picture, and my assets were in theirs. It's a hard thing to admit, that the people you love are waiting for you to fade, gently, politely, so they can pick through the remains without guilt. And yet, the signs were all there. I didn't miss them. I just chose not to see. Until now. The house creaks differently at night. Not from age, though it has plenty of that, but from memory. Each step I take down the hallway carries the echo of a time when the floorboards weren't so quiet, when laughter bounced off the walls and muddy shoes were left at the door by people who didn't yet know how fast life slips away. This house wasn't just bricks and lumber. It was built slowly, with arguments over paint swatches and dinners eaten on upside-down boxes before we had furniture. Robert and I moved in the year David turned 6. Back then, the backyard was just a patch of weeds and broken fence posts. Robert spent the whole summer turning it into a garden. Tomatoes, lavender, green beans, a little rose corner that never quite bloomed the way he wanted. But he kept trying. Every spring, he wore this ridiculous burgundy wool scarf I'd knitted the first winter we were married. He claimed it was his lucky planting scarf. I teased him, called him dramatic, said he looked like a Victorian ghost gardener, but he wore it anyway. Said it reminded him of me, said it made things grow. After he passed, I found that scarf in the garage, folded carefully in a drawer next to his gardening gloves. I brought it inside, washed it by hand, and laid it across the back of his armchair in the den. It's still there now. I touch it sometimes when I pass by, as if the wool still holds the shape of his shoulders. There are mornings I sit in that chair with tea, feet tucked under a worn quilt, and I swear I can feel the weight of his hand on mine, steady, reassuring, quiet like him. This house remembers. It remembers the nights I stayed up late grading papers at the kitchen table while Robert finished dental charts. The fridge still hums the same way it did when David came home with his first C and cried because he thought he'd disappointed us. It remembers the year we couldn't afford Christmas gifts, so we made each other presents. David gave me a necklace made of paper clips and yarn. I still have it. There's a dent on the hallway doorframe from when Robert tried to carry the new bookshelf upstairs without measuring the angle. We never fixed it. Said it was character. That's what this house has. Character. It's not perfect, but it's layered with stories. Now, every time someone talks about me moving out, downsizing, or starting a new chapter, I look around and wonder, what happens to a story when no one wants to remember it? What happens to the walls that heard lullabies, whispered forgiveness, held arguments, and made peace over burnt toast? I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter yesterday. Same counter where I once rolled out cookie dough with David standing on a wooden stool beside me. He used to sneak chocolate chips and insist the cookies tasted better when he helped. I never corrected him. Now he walks through this house like he's measuring it, like he's already sold it in his head. The other day, He asked how old the roof was. Not how I was, not how I'd slept, or whether I still remembered to take my vitamins. Just the roof. Camilla stood in the hallway with her phone out, taking photos of the molding. Said, "This kind of detail's hard to find these days." She meant it as a compliment, but it felt like a countdown. The funny thing is, I'm not afraid of leaving this house one day. I know I won't live forever. I'm not so sentimental that I think bricks are blood, but I am afraid of being erased. I'm afraid that once I'm gone, this place will be gutted, painted beige, listed as a fixer-upper with potential, and that no one will ever know how much love lived here. I'm afraid that what mattered to me, what shaped me, will become someone else's forgotten clutter. So I ask myself, often late at night when the house sighs under the weight of wind, if these walls could talk, would they say I mattered? Would they say I was more than just the keeper of clean laundry and warm meals? Would they say I held this family together longer than anyone realized? I don't need a monument. I don't need a plaque. But I need to know that the life I lived inside these walls meant something. And lately, the people who used to make this house feel full have been making it feel smaller, colder, as if it's time for me to go. But what they don't realize is that I've been here through every crack, every storm, every repair. And maybe they see walls, but I see roots. Roots I'm not ready to let them dig up. Not yet. Not like this. That night, I didn't sleep. I turned off the lights like usual, brushed my teeth, tucked the edges of the quilt around my legs the way I always do when the air feels thin with memory. But my body wouldn't rest. It was like my bones knew something my heart was still trying to deny. At 1:13 a.m., I reached for my phone. It was still there. The message. David's voice, still waiting in the shadows. I didn't want to hear it again, but something inside me needed to. Not for clarification, because every word had already carved its way into my skin, but for confirmation, for finality, for the proof I hadn't imagined it all. I pressed play. I can't stand this useless old hag. Once she's gone, her 8 million will be ours. Paris, here we come. I held the phone to my ear, as if keeping it closer might dull the sharpness. But it didn't. I heard his breath. That little half-laugh he does when he thinks he's being clever. I heard Camilla's soft agreement, the clink of what sounded like a wine glass, and then the fade out of conversation as if they'd moved on to other things. My thumb hovered over the screen. I played it again, slower this time, not in actual speed, but in the way memory distorts everything when your soul is aching. Every syllable dragged like heavy fabric over broken glass. I can't stand. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Sharper. Not the boy who once cried because his goldfish died. Not the teenager who brought me a hand-picked bouquet of dandelions and wild grass and called it a recession-proof Mother's Day gift. I played it again. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. And somehow I needed to feel every word settle into the places inside me where illusions had lived too long. I set the phone down, face up, and stared at the ceiling. When David was 7, we had a thunderstorm so loud it knocked out the power for half the block. He crawled into bed with us, his little pajama-clad body trembling like a leaf in a storm drain. Robert was still asleep, so I wrapped David in my arms and whispered stories into his ear until the thunder felt less like a monster and more like music. He told me once, years later, that he remembered that night as the time my mom made the sky less scary. And now, his voice is what scares me most. I sat up in bed, pulled the blanket tighter, and looked toward the door of the room that used to be his. It's a sewing room now, a place for quiet. But that night, the walls felt closer, the air heavier, like grief had its own gravity and was pulling me inward. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just listened to the silence between playbacks. It was thicker than any silence I'd ever known. And in that silence, something broke. Not loudly, not with violence, but with stillness. The kind of breaking that sounds like truth. I realized then that I had stopped being his mother in his mind. Not the mother who kissed scraped knees or stayed up until 2 a.m. proofreading college essays, but the mother he used to value. Now, I was a line item, a future windfall, a placeholder until Paris, and that hurt more than anything I could describe, because I never meant to hear that. I never meant to find out this way. If he had said it to my face, maybe I could have argued, demanded, shouted. But this was naked truth spoken in private when he didn't think I was listening. And those are the words that count most. I got out of bed slowly, feet bare against the cold floor, walked down the hall and into the den. The scarf was still there, slung across the back of Robert's chair. I wrapped it around my shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and soil. Like him. I sank into the chair and let my body remember what it felt like to be loved without calculation. Then, without another word, I picked up my phone and deleted the message. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed to prove what I already knew. Some things, once heard, don't need to be played again. They echo forever anyway. By morning, the sun spilled across my kitchen floor like it had no idea my world had just cracked open. I made coffee the same way I always do. 2 scoops, cinnamon, no cream. The mug I used was chipped on the handle, but I liked it that way. Some things feel more honest when they're imperfect. I sat at the table, wrapped in Robert's old scarf, and stared at the folder labeled "In Case of Contingency." It had sat untouched in the safe for 3 years. I had dusted around it, never inside it. But now I knew exactly what I needed to do. The phone call to Glenn was short. "Is it time?" he asked, without preamble. "It is," I said. "I've heard enough. I'll be there by noon." That was all. I spent the next few hours in silence. No TV, no music. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old kitchen clock Robert used to grumble about fixing. The house felt like it was holding its breath with me. At 11:57, Glenn pulled into the driveway. He always was precise. I opened the door before he knocked. He didn't smile, neither did I. He set his briefcase on the dining table and opened it with the same care one might use to unfold a flag at a funeral. Inside were documents, tabs, and a leather-bound binder I hadn't seen since Robert's hospital room. We sat without words for a long moment. Then he asked gently, "Do you want to talk first?" I shook my head. He opened the binder and began. "This is the current version of the trust," he said, flipping pages slowly. Robert included clauses that trigger automatic updates if certain conditions are met: undue influence, emotional coercion, patterns of manipulation. He slid one paper forward. "This is the verification form. If you sign this, we activate the clause that transfers all primary assets to the secondary beneficiary." "The charitable trust," I said softly. "Yes, specifically a scholarship foundation in your and Robert's name. Education access for underprivileged girls. Robert wanted something that carried your legacy forward if the children ever showed their teeth," I finished. Glenn hesitated, then nodded. I looked at the signature line for a long time, my name already printed neatly, a black pen resting beside it. "I never thought I'd need this," I said. "No one ever does," Glenn replied. I reached for the pen but didn't touch it yet. "Glenn, if I do this, there's no coming back, is there?" "No," he said honestly. But there's safety. There's peace. Will they be notified? Only if they contest. Otherwise, no changes are visible on paper until you pass. To them, everything will appear unchanged, unless they push. I exhaled. Are you sure? Glenn asked, quietly. I looked up at him. I'm past sure. I picked up the pen and signed. It didn't feel like revenge. It didn't feel like power. It felt like drawing a line in wet concrete and knowing it would harden, knowing I wouldn't cross it, even if they cried on the other side. Glenn pulled out another envelope. There's one more step. He handed me a document to initial, an addendum to the medical directive. If either child claimed I was unfit to make decisions, the clause would initiate a third-party evaluation from 2 certified specialists. If manipulation was proven, the assets would permanently lock into the charitable trust, irrevocable. This is Robert's way of making sure no one gaslights you into doubt, Glenn said. I initialed every line, and then we sat in silence again. No tears, no anger, just a quiet kind of clarity. Eventually, Glenn closed the binder and slid it back into his briefcase. You know, he said, standing, Robert used to say you were the strongest person he ever met. Not loud, not flashy, just rooted roots crack concrete, I murmured. He smiled for the first time. As he walked out, I followed him to the door. Before stepping onto the porch, he turned and asked, What now? I looked past him, toward the hydrangeas blooming stubbornly by the mailbox. Now, I said, I wait for them to show up for soup. And I let them learn that their mother still knows how to hold a line. Glenn nodded. I closed the door gently behind him, and in the silence that followed, I felt the weight lift, just slightly. Not gone, but lighter. Because now the plan was no longer in theory. It was in motion. The next morning, my phone buzzed with 2 messages. The first was from Camilla. We're excited for your famous soup tomorrow. Should we bring dessert? The second came shortly after, from David. We'll bring wine. You rest. Just looking forward to seeing you, Mom. I stared at the screen for a long time, let it sit on the counter while the coffee brewed. I didn't answer either message. Instead, I walked to the pantry and reached for the old tin of Earl Grey I kept above the spice rack, the one they never bothered to touch. I slid the tea tin aside, revealing the shelf behind it. There, tucked neatly, was the manila envelope Glenn had left behind, documents signed, notarized, and stamped. I didn't hide it. Not anymore. This time, I left it visible. Not screaming for attention. Just present. If they opened the wrong drawer or reached for the sugar, they'd see it. I wanted them to. Not as a warning. Not even as a threat. Just as truth. Sitting quietly where they never looked. I went about the rest of the day the way I always did before they came to visit. Washed the linens, opened the windows to let in some sun, clipped rosemary from Robert's garden patch, and placed it on the cutting board. My chicken soup takes hours. Not because it has to, but because it's how I learned to cook. Slowly, intentionally, letting flavor steep into every corner of the pot. It was David's favorite when he was little. He used to call it magic soup, especially when he had a cold. I'd let him crush the saltines himself, drop them in with a dramatic hand like a tiny chef performing a sacred ritual. He'd slurp it noisily, smile at me with cracker crumbs stuck to his chin, and say, "You're the best cook in the world, Mom." I don't think he remembers that, but I do. I set the table with the same blue plates I've used for decades, chipped slightly on the rims. The napkins were ironed and folded, though I knew they'd likely go untouched. Everything looked the same, smelled the same, but it wasn't the same. This time, the air carried weight. The kind you can't see, but you feel when you walk into a room and something inside you says, "Be careful. This is the moment before something changes." Around 3 p.m., I took the scarf off the back of Robert's chair and wrapped it around my shoulders. It was warm, worn soft with time. I wore it like armor. The soup simmered. The sun fell slowly across the living room floor. And I waited. Not for confrontation, not for drama, just for the next inevitable step. They thought this visit would be like every other, that I would greet them with a smile, serve soup in silence, and nod politely while they dropped hints about the future. But this time, the table was set differently. The envelopes were in place. The tea tin was nudged just far enough. And I was no longer the same woman who mistook manipulation for concern. They didn't know that. But they would. Soon. And when they did, it wouldn't be because I raised my voice or threw a scene. That's never been my way. Instead, they would meet a woman who had heard everything, remembered everything, and still made the soup. Because dignity doesn't flinch. It just waits. Quietly, patiently, until truth walks through the front door and realizes it's not the only one holding power anymore. They arrived an hour late. No text, no apology, just the sound of tires crunching against gravel, followed by a knock that was somehow both cheerful and hollow. I opened the door. Camilla stood there, smiling wide, holding a bouquet of chrysanthemums. Yellow, big, bright. "Hi, Kathleen. We brought your favorite." I didn't flinch, though the scent was already starting to stir that all-too-familiar sting in my sinuses. I've been allergic to chrysanthemums since I was a girl. David knew that. He used to tell his teachers not to let him take them home from school plays or concerts. "They make my mom sneeze," he'd say proudly, like protecting me was a badge of honor. I guess the memory was no longer useful. Still, I took the flowers, thanked her softly, and placed them on the porch table, outside, where they couldn't hurt me. David leaned in to kiss my cheek. His cologne was stronger than usual. Camilla's heels clicked against the tile as they stepped inside. I watched their eyes. It didn't take long. Camilla's gaze flicked to the china cabinet, lingering half a second longer on the crystal decanters. David scanned the room like he was memorizing layout, his eyes brushing over the grandfather clock, the bookshelf, the framed cross-stitch Robert's mother had made for us as a wedding gift. "Looks the same as ever," he said. "It is the same," I replied. They followed me into the kitchen, where the soup waited, warm and fragrant, in the Dutch oven. The table was already set, same blue dishes, same silverware, the napkins folded crisp, everything ready. Camilla pulled out a chair. Smells amazing as always. You really shouldn't have gone through all this trouble." "No trouble," I said. "It's just soup." David opened the wine, the one they brought, a label I didn't recognize, probably expensive. He poured generously for himself and Camilla, just a splash for me. I watched the red swirl in my glass, rich, dark, opaque in more ways than one. We sat. Camilla started with weather. David followed with work. Real estate was volatile, he said, but he had a few irons in the fire. They laughed about their neighbors' ugly Christmas decorations. I nodded along, spooned soup slowly, offered bread, and then it came, just as predictable as the wine, just as scripted. David set his spoon down, folded his hands like he was about to offer grace, and said, "So, Mom, about the house." Camilla turned to look at me, head tilted in that performative sympathy I'd come to recognize too well. "It's just that it's such a big space for one person. And we know you've mentioned how hard it is to keep up sometimes." I hadn't. David jumped in. "And with housing prices so high right now, it might be the perfect time to downsize. You could get a cozy condo, less maintenance, fewer stairs I didn't answer." I took another sip of soup. Let the steam rise between us like a curtain. Camilla tried again. Of course, we only bring it up because we care. We just want what's best for you. I nodded slowly, as if considering. Then I looked up, smiled gently, and asked, "Would you like more soup?" They blinked. David recovered first. Sure, yeah." I stood, ladled more into his bowl, and returned to my seat. They stared at me for a beat, clearly waiting for a response that would never come. Because here's the truth. Silence is stronger than rebuttal. Silence makes people uncomfortable in a way shouting never could. When you don't defend, don't argue, don't protest, people start to question themselves. And I wanted them to sit in that discomfort, to feel it the way I had felt their schemes, quiet, invasive, ever present. So I just kept smiling, kept passing the bread, kept holding on to the warmth of Robert's scarf draped across my shoulders. Let them make their pitch. Let them measure the table with their eyes. Let them sip wine and believe they still had time. They didn't know the paperwork was tucked beneath the tea tin in the cabinet above David's head. They didn't see the way the house had already shifted, how the power had already changed hands. They thought they were here for soup and strategy, but they were dining with someone who had already chosen a different inheritance for them. Silence, distance, and the consequences of underestimating a mother who remembers everything. They were still talking when I reached for my phone. David had gone off on a tangent about planning ahead, how people in his office were helping their parents simplify their lives. Camilla nodded dutifully, chiming in with how modern retirement communities offered everything: fitness classes, movie nights, meal plans. "It's not about pushing you out," she said, her tone sugar-coated. "It's about letting go of burden. So you can finally relax." I sipped my soup. "You deserve ease, Mom," David added. "You've worked hard enough." Why not let yourself breathe a little? Think of it as liberation, liberation. As if this home, this life, was a prison I'd built with my own hands. As if everything I'd held together for decades could be summed up in a line item and down payment potential. I said nothing. Just reached for my phone, set it gently beside my bowl, turned the volume all the way up, and tapped play. His voice filled the room. "I can't stand this useless old hag. Once she's gone, her 8 million will be ours. Paris, here we come." Silence. Real silence. Not the kind that happens between dinner courses or when someone's lost in thought. This silence had teeth. It carved the air open and made it hard to breathe. Camilla's spoon hovered mid-air, frozen. David blinked, his jaw slightly unhinged, like a door he didn't know had been left open. No one moved. No one spoke. I reached over, tapped the screen again, played it a second time. Not because I needed to hear it again, but because I wanted them to. Useless old hag. Once she's gone. Paris. I placed the phone down slowly, folded my hands in my lap, and looked up. No expression, no rage, just quiet. Camilla was the first to speak. What was that?" Her voice cracked, small and unsure. David swallowed hard. "Mom, that was taken completely out of context." I raised an eyebrow. "Out of context?" I said softly. He leaned forward, suddenly urgent. It was meant as a joke. Between me and Camilla. I didn't mean it. Not like that Camilla jumped in, voice high and brittle. It was sarcasm, dark humor. We were venting. You know how people talk when they're stressed. "Stressed?" I echoed. "By what, exactly?" "My breathing?" David's face flushed. "Mom, please. You have to know we love you. That message, look, it was awful. I know, but it wasn't serious. I was venting. I'd had a bad day." So you talked about waiting for me to die. Neither of them answered. The room felt heavy, like all the years I had swallowed pain were rising to fill the air around us. Camilla looked toward David, as if silently begging him to take the lead. He did. But his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. We were just talking about what comes next. Preparing. Maybe we handled it wrong, but we weren't trying to hurt you. No, I said, folding my napkin slowly. You were just trying to plan your vacation around my death. There's a different silence again, longer this time. The soup was still warm, but no one touched it. David's eyes fell to the table. I messed up, he whispered. Camilla nodded, eyes glassy. We both did. I stood up, pushed my chair back gently, walked over to the cabinet, opened it slowly, as if I were reaching for a jar of tea. Instead, I slid out the manila envelope, set it on the table beside the wine. Neither of them reached for it. That's what happens next, I said. David's lips parted, but I raised a hand. No more words. Not tonight, not in this house, not after that voice message. Because sometimes silence is not the absence of sound, it's the presence of truth. And tonight, truth sat heavier than any apology they could offer. David tried to speak first. Of course he did. He always was the first to speak when caught, filling the silence with just enough half-truths to make you doubt what you already knew. Mom, listen, okay? Please. That message, it wasn't fair, I know. I shouldn't have said it. I was frustrated. I wasn't thinking straight. It was one of those offhand things people say when they're overwhelmed. He paused, searching my face for softness. There was none. Camilla jumped in quickly. It's been a tough year. His commission's down, we've been under pressure. I lost my job in March, remember? We've just been talking about how to get back on track. We never meant... When did you book the hotel in Paris? I asked quietly. They froze. Camilla blinked. I'm not sure what you mean. You said you were just venting, that you were overwhelmed, that the message didn't mean anything. So I'm asking, when did you book the hotel in Paris? David's face reddened. Camilla opened her mouth, then shut it. I reached for my phone again. I didn't need to play the message this time. Instead, I opened the photo, turned the screen toward them. A screenshot of Camilla's Instagram story, posted 4 days ago. Can't wait for our Paris dream trip. Finally booked it. Geotagged, Le Maurice, Paris. Date stamped. Public. David looked down. Camilla tried to speak again, but nothing came out. The silence that followed didn't feel heavy this time. It felt clean, like the space right after a storm, when the air smells like honesty, when everything has been stripped away, decorum, excuses, facades, and what's left is just the quiet of truth. I looked at both of them. So, I said softly, you booked the trip before the message was even sent. Neither of them responded. You were celebrating a future I hadn't left yet. Camilla's voice broke. Kathleen, we didn't think you'd... What? Live long enough to notice? David looked up, eyes glassy. I didn't know she posted that. I didn't even... I cut him off with just a look, not a sharp one, not angry, just done. This time, I said slowly, I didn't cry. And I didn't. Not like the night I first heard his voice call me useless. Not like the nights I sat up wondering where I went wrong, wondering how the boy who once begged me not to give away his teddy bear could one day treat me like I was an old piece of furniture. No, this time I didn't cry, because the grief had already passed. What stood in its place wasn't sadness. It was certainty. Camilla whispered something about not meaning for it to go this far. David kept rubbing his hands over his face, like trying to wipe guilt off like sweat. But I didn't offer comfort, not this time, because they weren't crying out of shame. They were crying because they got caught. I stood slowly, carried my soup bowl to the sink, and rinsed it out. Behind me, the clinking of their silverware stopped. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to accuse, didn't need to defend my right to breathe. All I had to do was look at them and let the silence speak for itself. The kind of silence that says, "You've shown me who you are. I believe you now." And I never needed to cry again over people who had already decided I was worth more gone than alive. I didn't raise my voice, didn't slam my hand on the table or throw my soup bowl across the room. That's not who I am. That's not how I was raised, and not how I raised them. Instead, I moved slowly, quietly, steady like the tide. I walked over to the cabinet above the tea rack, opened it, and pulled down the manila envelope they hadn't even noticed earlier, though Camilla had stood inches from it when she admired my classic kitchen layout. I brought it to the table, laid it down between the wine bottle and the bread basket. "This," I said, tapping the envelope, "is the new will." David's eyes narrowed, trying to read my expression. Camilla stiffened. "And this," I continued, sliding out the top document, "this is the trigger clause." They said nothing at first. I let the words hang in the air like smoke from a fire they didn't know had already burned through the foundation. David leaned forward, his voice lower than before. "Mom, what does that mean?" Camilla stayed frozen, as if blinking might make the paper disappear. I unfolded the document and read the line aloud, my voice calm, measured. "If the grantor experiences, observes, or is made aware of undue emotional coercion, exploitation, or planning related to premature death or estate transfer by any primary beneficiary, the estate in its entirety shall be redirected to the charitable trust designated under Appendix C1. Set it down. No theatrics, no performance, just the law and the truth." David's face lost all color. Camilla's lips parted. You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I said. She looked to David, panicked now. "Is this legal?" "It's airtight," I replied before he could stammer through a guess. The blood drained from her cheeks. "But this isn't fair." I smiled gently. "Neither is planning a celebration for my death." They flinched, as if the sentence itself had slapped them. David tried to recover. "You're misunderstanding everything. This clause, the timing. It's just a document. It's not reality." "No," I said. "What you wanted was the reality. I gave you the paper because it's the only language you seem to respect." Camilla's voice rose an octave, brittle and defensive. "But Kathleen, you can't just take everything away over one mistake." "It wasn't one mistake," I cut in. My voice wasn't loud, but it landed hard. It was a pattern. The brochures, the conversations, the voice message, the trip, the hotel booking, the quiet questions about property value, the way you've looked at this house since the day Robert died. David stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. His jaw clenched, eyes darting to the folder again, like it might catch fire if he stared hard enough. "You really mean to disinherit your own son?" he asked. "I mean," I said, standing to meet his gaze, "to protect myself from people who no longer see me as a person, but as a problem. Or worse, an investment he didn't speak. Neither did she. And for once, I didn't fill the silence for them. I let it stretch, let it swell, let it hurt. Because this was the moment they realized they'd miscalculated something far more powerful than money. They had underestimated a mother's capacity to endure, and her quiet capacity to act. Camilla reached for her wine, but her hand trembled. David looked like he'd swallowed sand. I walked to the kitchen sink, rinsed my empty bowl, and placed it gently in the rack. Then I turned back and said, "You can stay for dessert if you'd like." But the conversation is over, because what they didn't know was that I had already let them go. The will just made it official. They left just after dusk. No hugs, no promises, just a hurried collection of coats and excuses. David muttered something about needing time to process, while Camilla avoided eye contact, clutching her purse like it held the last bit of leverage she had left. I didn't walk them out. I just stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a dish rag, and listened to the front door close. The house fell quiet again. Only this time, it wasn't heavy. It was clean. Still. Like a room that had finally aired out after years of holding in breath. I turned back to the counter where the apple pie I'd made that morning still sat, untouched, save for the 2 neat slices I'd served with trembling hands and a hollow smile. It was Robert's recipe, not mine. He used to peel the apples in long, curling ribbons, humming Patsy Cline under his breath. He said the secret to a perfect pie wasn't in the sugar or the crust. It was in the patience. Let the fruit do the talking, he'd say, with that sly smile of his. I'd made the pie for David. I'd made it from habit, from muscle memory, from some desperate, lingering belief that maybe, just maybe, he'd take one bite and remember. Remember when he was 7 and I wrapped slices in foil for his lunchbox. Remember the birthday he cried because the bakery forgot to include apple, and I baked one from scratch by candlelight. Remember who I used to be to him. But he hadn't touched it. Neither had she. And now, I couldn't look at it without feeling like a fool. I wrapped the rest of the pie in foil, deliberately, precisely, and walked it out through the back door. The night air was cool and still, the kind of September breeze that carries the scent of soil and leaves and quiet endings. The compost bin stood beneath the cedar tree, right next to Robert's rosebed. The pie made a soft, wet sound as it landed, too soft for what it deserved. I stood there for a long time, hands still, gripping the empty pie tin, staring down at the mound of coffee grounds, eggshells, and now, memories I'd refused to let go of until tonight. You were right, Rob, I whispered, about everything. The words didn't crack, they didn't tremble, they just came, steady, resigned, true. I turned, and there it was, his old wooden chair, tucked beneath the arbor just like he'd left it. The burgundy wool scarf still lay draped over the backrest. It had faded some, but the fibers were still intact, still smelled faintly of lavender and pine and sweat and sun. I sat down slowly, letting the wood creak beneath me, pulled the scarf into my lap, ran my fingers along the frayed edge he always meant to repair but never got around to. You were right to be cautious, I said quietly. I thought I was strong enough to love them through it. Thought they'd come around, thought they were still mine. A wind stirred the garden. The roses rustled gently beside me, their petals soft against the night. But they weren't mourning me, Rob. They were measuring me. It wasn't bitterness. It was fact. They had made room for my absence long before I ever asked them to. All I did was confirm what they'd already rehearsed behind my back. I looked up at the stars, at the same sky we used to lie under on summer nights, you tracing constellations with calloused fingers, and me pretending to know their names. I hope you're somewhere quiet, I said, somewhere they can't touch, somewhere that still smells like apple pie and old leather and rain-soaked roses. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around me, not like a threat, but like a quilt, not like loneliness, but like freedom. The pie was gone. The conversation was done, and for the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I had finally earned. The knock on the door came 2 days later. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't angry. Just 2 polite raps, followed by silence. I peeked out the window and wasn't surprised. Sarah. She stood on the porch in a pale cardigan, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Her posture was careful, chin slightly lowered, like she was already apologizing just by existing. I opened the door without a word. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. "I brought your favorite tuna noodle. Thought you might want something warm." I stepped aside and let her in. She walked straight to the kitchen like muscle memory still lived in her feet. Placed the dish on the counter like she belonged there, like she hadn't spent the last 6 months choosing silence over truth. "It smells good," I said. She smiled, tight, unsure. "I didn't overdo the salt this time." I nodded, then went to the sink, turned on the faucet, and rinsed my hands, letting the silence stretch long enough to press against her nerves. She finally broke it. "I heard about what happened with David and Camilla. I can't believe they said those things to you." I turned the water off, dried my hands slowly, looked her in the eye. "They didn't say them to me, Sarah. They said them about me." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked down. "I'm not like them," she murmured. I walked over to the counter and picked up the casserole dish, placed it gently in the fridge. "You didn't speak like them," I said, "but you watched them speak." She stiffened slightly. "That's not fair." "No?" I asked. "Then let's be fair." I stepped toward the drawer near the spice rack, pulled it open, and took out the stack of mail I hadn't thrown away. Among them, still in its crisp envelope, was the glossy brochure for Silver Pines Senior Living, the one with cheerful seniors playing bridge and gardening in raised beds. I held it up. "Who sent this?" I asked. Sarah didn't answer. "Because David says he never mailed it. And Camilla doesn't know how to spell gerontology. Yet somehow it's in the subject line of the email that followed." Still silence. "So I'll ask again, Sarah. Who sent the first brochure?" She looked up at me then, eyes full of things she would never say out loud. Regret, fear, guilt, the whole symphony of soft betrayals. "I did," she whispered. I nodded once, slowly. "Thank you for finally saying it." She sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, fingers clutching the edge of her sleeves. "I didn't mean it like that. I wasn't trying to get rid of you." "You were trying to manage me," I said gently. "And that's almost worse." She looked up, blinking fast. "I just thought it might be safer, easier. You're alone here. What if something happens?" "Something did," I replied. "And none of you were here to stop it." Her shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry, Mom. Truly, I thought I was helping." "Helping who?" I asked. "Me or your own anxiety about what comes next?" She didn't answer. I walked to the cupboard, pulled out a single teacup, and filled it with hot water. "I loved you enough to trust your silence," I said quietly. "But silence is not the same as protection." "I know," she said. We stood there, two women with the same bone structure and very different ideas of loyalty. "Can I make it right?" she asked. I didn't respond. Instead, I handed her the cup of tea. "Drink that while it's hot," I said. "Then we'll talk." Because forgiveness wasn't earned through casseroles. It began with confession, and maybe, she had finally started. It was early evening when I heard the second knock that week. Not urgent, not nervous, just familiar. I opened the door and there stood Ruth Callahan, my neighbor of 22 years, holding two mismatched teacups in one hand and a small plate of shortbread cookies in the other. Her white hair was pinned up in a soft twist, and she wore that blue cardigan I'd seen her weeding in just yesterday. She didn't ask for permission. She just gave me that look, part concern, part knowing, and said, "I saw them leave. Both cars. No hugs." I gave her a quiet smile. I'm still here. That was all I said, and somehow it was enough. She nodded, like she understood more than I'd said, and tilted her head toward her gate. Come sit in the garden a while. The roses are showing off tonight. I followed her. The air was soft and warm, the kind of September evening that made you believe summer wasn't quite done yet. Her backyard was small, but tended with care. Lavender bushes bloomed along the fence. Tomato vines climbed up trellises near the porch. And in the center, a round iron table with 2 chairs, already waiting for us. We sat. She poured chamomile tea from a chipped floral pot and placed the cookies between us. No one said anything for a long time. The silence didn't feel like the kind I'd just come from, the one that echoed with withheld truths and broken trusts. This one felt like rest. Eventually, Ruth broke it. You don't have to tell me anything. But I'll say this. Those kids of yours never fooled me. I let out a breath. Half a laugh, half a release. What gave them away? She shrugged. I've seen the way they park. Like the driveway owes them something. And they never leave your house smiling unless they're holding something. I smiled, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. I kept hoping it would get better. That maybe I was being too harsh. That grief made me suspicious. Ruth sipped her tea and looked out at her garden. Grief doesn't make us paranoid, Kathleen. It sharpens our eyes. We start seeing what was always there. I swallowed hard. Robert warned me. He said when money enters the picture, even the best hearts can get twisted. But I never thought it would be my children. She reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, her touch light but grounded. You're not alone in that, she said. More women on this street have been betrayed by their own than you'd ever guess. We just don't talk about it. We bake casseroles, prune roses, and pretend the calls are just late, not missing. We sat in that truth, unspoken, but deeply shared. I looked around her yard, at the daisies and the ivy, the chipped wind chimes swaying above us, the worn cushion on the chair that had seen too many seasons to count. How do you move on? I asked, barely louder than a whisper. Ruth smiled. You don't. Not all at once. First, you let go of the apology you'll never get. Then, you let yourself bloom anyway. I stared at the tea swirling in my cup, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry, or betrayed, or scared. I just felt tired, but safe. Thank you, I said. She nodded. You come over anytime, Kathleen. We women who survive betrayal, we don't heal by ourselves. We heal together. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the tomato leaves. And I realized something. While my children had underestimated me, the women around me never had. They knew. They'd always known. And they had waited for me to join them. Not with fanfare, not with speeches, just with presence, just with quiet, just with the truth that I was still here, and that I mattered. Glenn came by the next morning. He didn't call ahead. He didn't need to. Ever since Robert passed, Glenn had known when to appear. The man had a way of showing up right when the dust settled, when the air was still thick but survivable. He brought a small leather folder and 2 cups of black coffee. No sugar, no milk, just like Robert used to drink it. He didn't bother sitting until I did. We met at the kitchen table, the same table where David and Camilla had sat 2 nights earlier, only now the room felt different. No eyes skimming for heirlooms, no hidden motives dressed as concern, just truth. Glenn opened the folder without preamble. Robert left you more than the house. I didn't flinch, but I held his gaze. How much more? He pushed a printed spreadsheet toward me. 3 columns, 3 account numbers, 3 institutions I'd never seen before. All offshore, all legally managed under a trust name Robert had created a decade before he got sick. 3 accounts, Glenn said, all under your name. They've been growing in silence. He moved the funds gradually, in small amounts, kept them out of sight. Altogether, it totals just over $8 million. The number didn't hit me the way I thought it would. No gasp, no shock, just stillness. I stared at the paper, at the weight of zeros that no longer meant what they once did. Why didn't he tell me? I asked. Glenn folded his hands. He did, Kathleen. Not with numbers, but with intention. He told me he wanted to protect you in ways you wouldn't understand until you needed to. Said if the kids ever turned, if grief turned into greed, you'd have options. I leaned back in my chair. The scarf around my shoulders slid slightly down my arm. And I guess I needed to. Glenn nodded. You never touched the main account he left you. And you lived modestly. Which told them something, didn't it? I looked out the window, toward Robert's roses. The morning sun had started to warm the edges of the petals. It was never about the money, I said quietly. Not for me. Glenn tilted his head, curious. Then what was it about? I turned to him, my voice steady. It was about seeing how they'd behave if they thought I had less. His eyes softened. And now that you know? I didn't answer right away. I just reached for my tea, took a slow sip, and let the quiet speak for itself. Because now I knew everything, not just about the money, but about the people I had raised, about the ways they measured love in dollars, about the limits of their empathy, and the ceilings of their patience. And knowing meant I could finally stop pretending, stop hoping, stop waiting for something that had already made itself clear. What you do with it, Glenn said, tapping the folder. That's up to you now. I nodded. Let it sit for now. I'm not interested in Paris. We both smiled at that. He stood to leave, but paused at the door. Kathleen? Robert. He really did love you fiercely. This, everything he put in place. It wasn't paranoia. It was devotion. I walked him out. And as the door clicked shut behind him, I held the folder in my hands for a long time before placing it in the drawer beside Robert's scarf. The money was real, but the lesson had been priceless. The first message came in at 6:41 a.m. Camilla. Kathleen, I just want to say I'm sorry. Deeply. From my heart. We've canceled the trip. David feels awful. We both do. A few minutes later, another ping. This one was a video message from David, labeled "From the airport." I waited a long time before pressing play. He stood somewhere near a gate terminal, rows of plastic seats and overpriced snack carts in the background. He was dressed in a travel jacket, hair tousled like he hadn't slept. Mom? He began, voice low, awkward. I don't even know where to start. I guess I'm hoping it's not too late. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glanced sideways as if searching for the right words on the wall beside him. We canceled the trip. We were about to board, and I couldn't do it. Camilla and we talked about everything you said, about the message, the will, all of it. We were wrong. He hesitated, then leaned closer to the camera, as if proximity might fix what distance had broken. I know you probably don't believe us. And I wouldn't blame you, but we're trying to make it right. The video ended there. No dramatic flourish, no tears. Just a man who looked like a boy again. Only not the boy I raised. Just someone trying to patch a cracked window with a bandage. I set the phone face down on the counter and poured myself another cup of tea. No reply. No need. They had canceled the trip. But they hadn't canceled the reason they booked it. That trip wasn't an impulse. It had been planned. Deposits paid. Photos saved. Hashtags drafted. They weren't running from grief. They were running toward a prize they assumed would be theirs. Their apology came only after the will was revealed, after the recording was played, after their plan, not their conscience, fell apart. And maybe, once upon a time, I would have accepted that as enough. Maybe I would have replied with something motherly, "I know you didn't mean it," or "We all make mistakes." But not now, because some things don't rewind, and you don't cancel your greed in one text. You don't unplan a celebration of someone's death and expect the RSVP to forgiveness to arrive immediately. You don't build a fantasy around my funeral and then ask for dessert when the oven's still warm. I left the messages unread, not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining why I deserved to be treated like more than a ledger. I walked out to the garden and stood by Robert's rose bushes. The scarf he loved still draped over the bench beside me, catching the wind. I closed my eyes and let the breeze brush against my cheek. They had their Paris dream, but mine was far simpler. Peace, clarity, distance from those who only learned how to love when the will changed. And this time, I wasn't answering the door to guilt wrapped in digital ribbons. Not anymore. Glenn came by again the next morning. He looked more rested this time, less like a man carrying secrets, and more like someone who had watched the truth land exactly where it was supposed to. He sat down at my kitchen table, same chair as before, hands folded neatly like he always did when he was about to say something I might not like. I poured the coffee without being asked. We sat for a moment in comfortable silence, just two people with shared history, letting the stillness speak first. Then, finally, Glenn leaned forward. "Kathleen, I need to ask, do you want to press charges?" I didn't respond immediately. I stirred a little honey into my cup, slowly, watched the swirl disappear into the dark. "What would the charges be?" I asked, not because I didn't know, because I wanted to hear it out loud. Glenn sighed, pulled a folder from his leather case, and placed it gently on the table. Technically, conspiracy to defraud, emotional manipulation for financial gain, possibly elder coercion. Nothing rock solid, but we've got enough for an investigation, especially with the message, the Paris booking, and the clause they triggered. I nodded. He didn't push. He knew better. "I'm not doing it," I said after a long pause. Glenn looked surprised. Not disappointed, just surprised. "You sure? We'd have a solid case. And frankly, you'd be protecting others too. If they did it to you, then they'll answer for it somewhere else," I interrupted gently. He waited, so I continued. "I've spent my whole life raising children who would never imagine their mother walking into a courtroom to have them prosecuted. And maybe that was my mistake, raising them with the benefit of the doubt. But I won't raise my voice now just to satisfy a moment of power." Glenn studied me. "You're not angry?" "Oh, I'm furious," I said. "But fury fades. Distance doesn't." He sat back, quiet. "What they wanted," I continued, "was access. Control. To reduce me down to a number they could anticipate. What they got was silence. I let that land. Then added, "And that's harder to manipulate than any courtroom outcome." He gave a small nod. "So this is what? Your quiet revenge?" I smiled, not cruelly, just clearly. "No, this is their quiet lesson. Will you ever tell them about the other accounts?" "Not unless they earn it," I said. "And even then, I may not need to." I looked out the window. The garden was alive with morning light, and Ruth's cat had wandered into my yard again, sunning himself like it was his home too. "You know what the hardest part was?" I asked softly. Glenn shook his head. "It wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing how long I had tolerated the slow erosion of decency, simply because it was wrapped in family ties. He didn't speak, didn't have to. Robert left me money, I went on. Yes, but he also left me something more useful, a standard, a reminder that love isn't an inheritance, it's a responsibility. And if they couldn't handle that when they thought I was broke, they don't deserve access now. Glenn closed the folder, didn't reopen it. So, he said finally, what do we do with all this? We document it. Quietly. We lock it away, and we let the silence teach, because immunity doesn't heal. But distance gives you room to breathe again, room to grow. And for the first time in years, I was finally growing away from what was once my center, but had turned into my cage. Quiet revenge? Number. Just a mother finally choosing herself. The house was almost empty now. Not in a sad way. Not the kind of empty that echoes with absence. No, this was the good kind of empty, the kind that made space for what came next. The donation truck had left that morning with most of the furniture. The dining table, the old chest of drawers, the floral couch that had seen too many arguments and too few real conversations. Gone. I kept only what mattered. 3 boxes, 1 suitcase, and a map. The new place wasn't far, just a few hours north, by the lake Robert always talked about retiring to. He never got the chance, but I'd found a small cottage there, tucked beneath a canopy of elms and oaks, with a porch that overlooked the water. Quiet, untouched, like it had been waiting for me all along. I packed slow, deliberate, measured. Each object I kept passed a simple test. Did it serve the woman I've become, not just the one I was trying to preserve? Most things failed, but not the scarf. That old burgundy wool scarf, still faintly carrying the scent of lavender and rain, was the last thing I packed. I folded it carefully, twice over, edges aligned just so, and placed it in a small cedar box. Not buried under papers or clothes, but resting on top, as if it deserved light. Because it did. That scarf wasn't just his. It was ours. It had caught the tears I wouldn't let fall in the hospital. It had kept my hands warm on the nights I sat alone in the garden, wondering if motherhood was supposed to feel so lonely after 60. It had held his memory when nothing else could. I set the box on the bookshelf I was bringing with me, the only piece of furniture I insisted on keeping. Not for its shape or design, but because it had always carried the stories. I looked around once more. The house didn't look back. It was just drywall and windows now. No ghosts. No guilt. I didn't take the wedding portrait. Left it wrapped in bubble paper inside a drawer. Maybe I'd revisit it someday. But for now, it felt like a chapter already closed. Instead, I packed the map of Ireland, folded and worn at the corners, with little red dots we used to mark the places we dreamed of visiting. Galway, Dingle, a quiet village in County Clare where his grandmother was born. We never made it there together. Life had gotten in the way. Then death. But dreams, real dreams, don't expire. They wait. I tucked the map into the outer sleeve of my suitcase, not as a souvenir of a life we didn't live, but as a promise to the one I still could. As I turned off the lights, I glanced one last time at the hallway mirror. The woman who looked back at me wasn't bitter. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even angry anymore. She was just ready. Time to live the rest, I whispered, not the remainder. And I meant every word, because I'd spent too many years shrinking inside the roles people cast for me. Mother, widow, keeper of the house, silent supporter. I had honored them all. But now I would honor myself, not by burning bridges, but by building a new path, one where I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring or the doorbell to mean affection, one where the quiet wasn't punishment. It was peace. I closed the door behind me. And for the first time, it didn't feel like leaving home. It felt like becoming one. It happened on my second morning at the lake cottage. I was unpacking the last box of dishes when the phone rang. Not my cell phone, my landline. I'd asked for one to be installed, out of habit more than anything. Something about the solid ring of a real phone made the world feel grounded. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up. "Mrs. Reeves?" the voice asked. Young, nervous, male. "Yes, speaking." There was a pause, then a soft inhale, like someone gathering their courage. "My name's Jordan Alvarez. I think you're the one who funded my scholarship?" I blinked, took a seat at the small kitchen table. "Which scholarship, sweetheart?" "The one through the Reeves Quiet Resilience Foundation," he said quickly, "for first-generation college students." "I'm studying architecture at Penn State." My heart tugged. That name, Reeves Quiet Resilience, was something Glenn and I had come up with a month ago when finalizing the new estate plan. It was Robert's idea, really. Or at least, his words. "Quiet resilience is your superpower, Kath," he used to say. "The world doesn't notice you until you've already saved it." We decided the best way to use the money wasn't just to protect it, but to plant it where it would grow into something none of the children expected. "Yes," I said softly. "Yes, Jordan, that's me." He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath his whole life. "I just wanted to say thank you. I don't have parents who really believed in me. My mom left when I was 10, and my dad's never been stable. This scholarship, it didn't just help me afford tuition. It made me feel seen." My throat closed. He kept talking, voice shaking a little. "I know I'm probably not supposed to call, but I found the office number and asked if they could connect me to the person behind it. They told me it was you, and I needed you to know that you changed something." I pressed my fingers to my lips, swallowing the emotion rising fast and thick. "You're doing all the work," I managed. "I just opened a door. You're the one walking through it." "Still," he said. "I never had a mom who believed in me before. So, thank you, Mrs. Reeves. Really." And then, in a voice so tentative it felt like a child asking for permission, "Would it be okay if I called you again sometime? Just to tell you how school's going?" My hand trembled slightly as I gripped the receiver tighter. "You can call me any time, sweetheart," I said. "And you don't have to call me Mrs. Reeves." There was a pause. Then, "What should I call you?" And in that moment, without hesitation, without apology, I said the first thing that came to my heart. "Call me Mom." He sniffled. "Okay, Mom. Thank you." I hung up slowly after he did, then sat still for a long time. The cottage was quiet except for the lake breeze brushing the screen door. Tears welled in my eyes, not because of what I'd lost, but because of what I had found. Somewhere out there, a young man I'd never met had called me Mom, and for once, it felt like the title meant something again. Not because of birth, but because of belief. And that, I realized, was enough to keep going. Ruth and I sat by the window at Willow Lake Cafe, steam rising gently from our mugs. It was the kind of place where no one rushed you, where conversations could meander without needing a destination. The wood-paneled walls were lined with old photos of fishermen and their catch, and the owner still knew regulars by name and coffee order. Outside, the lake shimmered under late autumn light. Inside, I felt a kind of quiet I hadn't known in years. Ruth stirred her tea, then looked over at me with that same steady curiosity she always had. "So," she said, her voice light but genuine, "what's next for you, Kathleen?" I smiled. Not the practiced kind I used to wear when guests arrived or when the children called asking for favors. This smile was rooted, soft, real. I'm writing again, I said. Really? Like journals? More than that, I replied. Stories, reflections, things I wish someone had written for women like me, women who gave everything to their families, and then were quietly pushed aside when we weren't needed anymore. Ruth nodded slowly. There's a lot of us. I know, I said. And I think it's time we start writing the next chapter ourselves, not just waiting to be written into someone else's will. She laughed gently, but there were tears in her eyes. Not sad ones. The kind that come when truth shows up in the room and sits beside you like an old friend. I looked out at the lake and thought of everything that had brought me here. The message, the scarf, the voice I hadn't used in years until it rose inside me like a wave that couldn't be swallowed anymore. The betrayal hurt. Of course it did. But the silence that followed, the intentional distance, had given me something I didn't know I needed. Room to become again. Room to remember that I mattered. That I was not disposable just because I wasn't needed to cut crusts off sandwiches or sign checks or babysit grandkids. I had never stopped mattering. I had only stopped reminding myself. Ruth finished her tea and reached for her purse. Well, if you ever need a reader, she said with a wink, I've got nothing but time and opinions. You'll be the first to know, I promised. We hugged outside the cafe, just as a breeze swept through, lifting the hem of my coat and brushing against my cheeks like Robert used to do with his fingers. Just a passing touch, full of memory. I walked home slowly, each step echoing something I hadn't dared believe for years. I was allowed to start over. I didn't need anyone's permission, and maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't ending. It was just changing narrators. When I reached the cottage, I lit a candle on the windowsill, opened my notebook, and wrote the first line. Sometimes losing your children is the only way to find yourself again. And I didn't cry. I smiled, because finally, I had stopped waiting for someone else to write my legacy. I was writing it myself. So what do you think? Was I too harsh? Too cold? Or was I finally choosing to live the life I'd forgotten I deserved? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever had to walk away to find yourself again, know this: you are not alone. You still matter.